So in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to set it up so that the player can actually jump on top of the enemy here and make them fall like so. And so that way we can actually be able to kill our enemies and get rid of them. So if they hit them from the side, it's not going to kill or do anything like that. However, if we jump on top of them, it will drop them to the ground. So the first thing that we're going to want to do here is actually go in and add a tag to our enemy prefab. So we'll go into our environment and we'll find an enemy, go into the prefab here, and up here under tag, we're going to click on add tag, click the plus, and I'm just going to call this one enemy, and we'll save. And we'll go back, and now we'll go back in here and tag that as enemy. And then if we go back and check our other enemies, they're all going to have that tag now. And the next thing we're going to want to do is create a new script. So we're going to use two scripts to complete this process. The first one I'm going to call LandOnEnemy. So we're basically going to check and confirm if we land on the enemy or not. And if we do, we're going to cause the enemy to fall off the screen. And so we'll go ahead and I'm just going to create the second script here as well. And I'm going to call this exactly what we're going to be doing. So enemy fall off screen. So once inside the LandOnEnemy script, we'll go ahead and we're going to remove these at the top just to clean that up a little bit. We will remove these comments as well, and also the update method, as we won't be using that. And then at the top, we're going to need to get a reference to the player's rigid body here. So the rigid body components. So we're going to call this, or we're going to do a private rigid body 2D and call that RB for rigid body. And then in our start, we're going to set that up so we can initialize the component as well. So RB with the rigid body 2D component there for get component. And then we're going to want to do an on collision enter. So, and this is going to control that. So we'll do a private void and then on collision enter, and make sure you select 2D. And the first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to make sure that what we're colliding with has the enemy tag. So if, and then we want to check if the collision .game object .compare tag, and then inside here we want to check for enemy. So if it has a tag of enemy, then what we're also going to want to do is we want to check inside of here is if the player is moving downward. So if the rigid body velocity y is less than 0. So if we're colliding with an enemy and we're moving downwards, then what we want to do, we'll want to do, make the enemy fall off the screen. And that is going to be in our other script. So for now, what we'll do is we'll just do a console.log here. And we'll say, hit the enemy or something. Doesn't matter what we put in there. Sorry, not a console log, but a debug.log. Like that. So now when we jump on the enemy, we should land on the enemy and we should see this in the console. And then before we proceed, let's just make sure we add this onto our player. So we got that there, and then let's do the override here just to make sure we have everything up to date on our player prefab. And we'll go ahead and test this out real quick. And if we run over here and jump on the enemy, we can see hit the enemy. So that's happening for us. So next up, we're going to jump into our enemy fall off screen script that we created here, and we'll clean this up a little bit as well by removing that and these comments. And then at the top, we're going to need to get references to a few different things. So we're going to start with the first one, which is going to be a rigid body 2D, and we'll again name this RB. This is going to be a reference to our rigid body component of the enemy. Next, we're going to need to do the collider 2D as well. I'm just going to call this one COL for collider, and that's going to be a reference to the collider 2D component that's on the enemy. Next, we're going to need a bool, and I'm going to call this one is falling, and I'm going to set that to false by default. And that's just going to be a flag to track if the enemy is currently falling or not. And then next up, we're going to need a serialized field, and this one is going to be of type float, and I'm going to call this one fall speed, and I'm going to set it to 5.0f for now. However, we'll be able to change that if we would like in the editor, and this is going to be the speed at which the enemy falls. So then now in our start method, we're going to want to initialize the rigid body and also the colliders, so we'll set those up like so. And then down here in update, we're going to do an if statement. So we're going to say if is falling. So if the enemy is supposed to be falling now, then we're going to do an rb.velocity, and that's going to equal a new vector2, and we're going to do 0, and then negative 0 for x, and then negative our fall speed for y. And that's basically going to say if the enemy is falling, then we're going to set its velocity to the negative fall speed. So we're going down. And then next we're going to create a method here, and this method is going to be our start falling method. And this is going to be public because we're going to access this via our LandOnEnemy script is where we're going to call this from. So it's going to be public void, and then we'll call it start falling. And then what we want to do when we call this is we're going to want to set is falling to true, because the player is going to be falling. And then we're going to want to adjust a couple things here. So the rigid body, we're going to want to set this is kinematic to false, as we want to ensure that it is dynamic to allow for falling. And then we're going to do rb.gravity scale just to make sure that we have a gravity scale, and we're going to set that one to 1. And then we're also going to need to do an constraints, and that's going to equal our rigid body constraints 2d.none. So that's going to remove all of the constraints on our rigid body. So how we have it constrained to the x, I believe we have it constrained so it doesn't rotate properly on the z, and it doesn't move on the y up and down, so the enemies don't move up and down. That'll remove those, so that way the enemy will be able to fall downwards. And then one other thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to check if the collider does not equal null. So if there is a collider, then we're going to want to do our collider.enabled and set that to false. So we're going to want to disable the collider component if it exists. So that way it will allow the enemy to pass through the ground. So then the last thing that we're going to want to do is back in our LandOnEnemy script, where we have the debug.log here, where we're just saying we're going to hit the enemy. This is where we'll actually trigger the enemy to fall off the screen. So what we'll do is we're going to do enemy fall off screen, and we're going to call that one our enemy fall script. So we're going to get a reference to that script. So that's going to equal our collision.gameObject.getComponent. So we're going to get that component there from the collision object. And we'll say if the enemy fall script does not equal null, so if there is an enemy fall script, then we will do enemy fall script dot we called it start falling. So then we'll call that here. So that's going to call the start falling method from our enemy fall script. So that's going to call this method here whenever we land on the enemy and we're moving downwards. And then back in the editor here, one last thing that we'll need to do is we'll need to go into our enemy again, into the prefab, and we want to add that the enemy fall script. So now if we test this out and click play, when we jump and hit this enemy from the top, you'll see that they are falling down now. So that's working as expected. You will see that we're still losing health when we do that, but we'll get that adjusted and fixed here in a later video, so we're not actually losing health anymore. But that is working as expected. And one thing that we can do here in our enemy fall off the screen script is we can add another serialized field here. And this is going to be a float, and we're going to simply call this a destroy delay. And I'm going to set mine equal to 5 for now, I think is fine for 5 seconds. And then down here underneath our if statement in our start falling method that we have here, what we can do is we can simply say, invoke. So, and then we'll enter in the name of the method that we want to invoke. And this hasn't been created yet, but we're just going to call it destroy enemy. And then here we'll enter in the time that we want to wait. So that's going to be our destroy delay. And then underneath here, right outside of the start falling method, we will create that method. So this is going to be a private void, and we'll call it the destroy enemy. Oops, and I spelled that wrong. Make sure you spell it correctly. And then in here, all we have to do is we'll just say destroy and then game object. So we're going to destroy the game object. So if we save that, we'll head over back to our editor here, and we'll go ahead and test this out just to make sure that it's working. We have the first enemy selected here, so we can double check and confirm. But if we jump and he drops, and we should see him after about 5 seconds, boom, he's gone. So it is destroying him. So that's going to be it for this video. It's a little bit of a shorter video as I didn't have much time, but thank everybody for watching.